Hi everyone, thanks for coming. My name is Aser Samak. I work at Google as an Android developer advocate. I focus on Android enterprise and security. And in this talk, we'll see how to get your app to work at work. So what I mean by work here is work profiles. Just a quick raise of hands, who's seen work profiles before or used it or heard of it? Okay, not that much. Cool, so this is probably why we're giving this talk. But before we talk into details about work profiles, let's just take a step back and see the big picture of where work profiles fit. So let's start with the question, what is Android Enterprise? Android Enterprise came to solve a very common problem that a lot of companies run into. Say a company wants to manage a bunch of devices, right? Either buys them themselves and then provides them to their employees, or allows employees to bring their own personal devices to access corporate emails or documents or any private information. If a company wants to manage these devices, they'll have to ask themselves some questions. What happens if a user loses their device? Will they be able to wipe out any sensitive data from that device remotely? Will they be able to locate such device and track any work activity running on it? And will they be able to enforce some security measures like screen locks and so much more, like forcing updates to their apps and maintaining them and such and such. So to deal with that, typically a company would have to install an app on all these devices that has admin privileges, and they will have to set some sort of cloud API to be able to remotely control these apps and enforce any security policies they want. This is where Android Enterprise fits in. So Google has created this infrastructure that allows companies to solve all these problems without having to implement any of that themselves. It comes with like three main components. The managed Google Play, which is similar to a typical Play Store, but it's curated, so it allows IT admins to select which apps can be available to their employees. It can also allow IT admins to publish private apps, which are in-house built apps for this particular company, so only employees can access those. And a lot of other security measures that can be applied, along with all the things that come out of the box with the Play Store as well, so malware protection and scanning and stuff. The second part is a bunch of cloud APIs that Google offers for third-party systems known as Enterprise Mobility Management Systems, or EMMs. And these EMMs basically build a console to allow IT admins to remotely control all these devices using those Google APIs. And the third component is the device policy controller, which is an app that gets installed on these devices to connect to those Google APIs and allow them to enforce these security policies. So these three components together build Android Enterprise, but we'll be focusing a little more on the device policy control and how that affects the device. And this brings us back to the work profile. So whenever someone provisions their device or enrolls their device in an enterprise world, a work profile gets created. And the reason behind this is to separate work and personal stuff. It allows IT admins to enforce security policies on particular apps and particular settings for those apps without really accessing or affecting personal stuff in any way. It also comes with the managed Play Store out of the box, so users would have their own personal Play Store and the managed Play Store. And a lot of really cool features from a usability point of view. People can turn off their work profile so they don't have to be bothered by work when they're away and stuff like that. And this is going to be the main focus of our talk. So if you haven't been listening to anything I've been saying so far, now it's a good time to wake up. So let's see why this is relevant to us, right? We're all building apps that don't really target enterprise, or at least some of us. But the thing is, your app might actually end up running in a work profile, even though that was not your intention. And because IT admins can enforce all these security policies, they can restrict a lot of things on your device, your app might behave differently. So what you should do as an app developer is always think of what restrictions can be enforced on those devices and how that might affect your app. And that's basically what I'll be trying to cover in this talk. So let's go through some best practices that app developers should be following in terms of work profile compatibility. These are some of the three top things that we've seen developers fall into and how to mitigate them, basically. The first thing is, or the most common thing is, work and personal contacts. So if your app is dealing with contacts, a lot of people face issues trying to load or deal with work contacts. We'll also cover sharing files across profiles and how profiles restrict and allow access to each other. And then finally, we'll talk about handling intents and how intents can cross profiles as well. And by profiles here, I mean work profile / personal profile. Okay, so with contacts, if your app is dealing with contacts, then you're probably using a contacts provider. The problem here is that work profiles separates work contacts from personal contacts. So if your app loads personal contacts fine, and you try to run that in a work profile, it might not load anything at all. And if you run it in a personal profile, it will not load any work contacts at all, which might be okay for some use cases, but some users might expect to have access to work contacts in their app as well. So to do that, you would need to use the correct content URI with your contacts provider. There are many ways you can load contacts. You can search for a contact with a name or an email or a phone number, or you could list directories like this URI. So when you use the enterprise content URI, though, it would allow you to load both your personal contacts and your work contacts. And to separate which is which, you should use the is enterprise directory ID, which will tell you whether this is a work directory or not. And you should also be aware that with work contacts, a lot of companies like to store their work contacts on a remote server. So if you're querying these contacts, you might be triggering a network call. So be mindful about that. And if you want to know if that is the case, you should be using is remote directory ID. And that will tell you whether it's a remote server or not. So that way you could basically cache those contacts if you want to load them again. You still need to have read contacts and write contacts permissions, just like you would normally do with regular contacts. And you should be aware that sometimes IT admins can restrict access to work contacts from your personal profile. So in that case, when you query using this URI, you might get an empty list for work profiles, for work contacts. You don't have to handle any errors there, but you should just be aware from a visual perspective. And in general, when we talk about visual, we want to keep in mind that users might not be aware where these contacts are coming from. So if you're going to display a list of contacts which include mix of personal work profile contacts, then you should either display them in separate lists. You could use icons to distinguish them from each other. And you should also ask yourself whether your app actually needs to display work contacts or not. But it's important to think of the end user in that regard as well. Another thing is accessing files. So again, work profile stores everything separately from personal profiles, and that's from a security and privacy perspective as well, which leads to some issues when you're trying to share a file that's stored in a personal profile and loaded in a work app, for example. And it's a general practice to we always recommend developers to use content URIs instead of file URIs. So file URIs contain the absolute path of a file. And if the shared memory or if the storage is not really accessible by another profile, then an absolute path doesn't really mean anything. So you should be generating a content URI whenever you're dealing with files and use that to allow access for any app that wants to load a file. To create a content URI, you should be using a file provider. So here's an example of a file URI that we had. The first thing, you should create a file out of that, and then pass that file along with the context and the authority provider, which is defined in your app manifest, to create a content URI, and then share that content URI across profiles. And that should be the general way of dealing with files. Okay, the last thing in terms of work profile best practices is intent handling, and this is a very common scenario as well. So typically, Android tries to handle intents within the same profile that the app is launching it. So for example, if your app is trying to launch a camera and the camera is installed in the work profile but it's disabled, then the app will basically, it's unexpected behavior in that case. And even though the camera might be working fine in a personal profile, then your app user might be like, why is it not working although I have a camera working? So Intents do not cross profiles by default, and IT admins like to disable a lot of really common intent handlers as well. So things that developers always assume are working fine in a personal profile might not be the case in a work profile. So what should we do as developers? Well, let's take a look at this intent, for example, which is trying to set a timer using the alarm clock. It created the intent, it set all the parameters, and then just immediately called start activity to launch the intent, which is totally fine in a personal profile because there's always an intent handler for that. But if for any reason this was disabled in a work profile and a user runs that, it actually might crash the app. So you should always check whether there is an intent handler using the resolve activity method. If it returns anything other than null, then there is an intent handler that you can deal with this. Otherwise, if it returns null, then you should change the flow of your app and either display an error message or something. But yeah, you should be doing this check on runtime because you never know what's enabled and what's not. All right, so that's enough with all the things that can go wrong in an enterprise world. Let's have a look at some of the really cool features that Android Enterprise actually offers, and you as an app developer can leverage as well. And yeah, in case your app actually is useful in a work environment. So manage configurations is a really cool feature that comes with Android Enterprise. And the idea is you can expose any configurations or settings that you have in your app so that an IT admin can remotely configure those settings for you. A common case for that is email apps, for example, who don't want their employees to have to enter proxy server settings and passwords and stuff like that. They can easily just enroll their device in the enterprise and then have IT admins set all that for them, and it will automatically log them in. Another use case is whitelisting or blacklisting URLs within a company. You can also allow printing over a VPN as well, so all the VPN settings can be sent over from the IT department to your app straight away. Okay, so how do you set that up in your app? It's actually really simple. There's like 3 steps that you have to go through. The first is expose or declare those configurations that you want to be able to customize, and then listen for any configuration changes that come from the remote APIs, and then send back a feedback of whether you've set those settings correctly or not. So let's have a look at the first step. What you want to do is add a tag in your Android manifest saying that I'm going to be applying some restrictions or manage configurations in my app, and then you link it to an app's restriction file, XML file, and then you create that file and list all the restrictions or configurations that you want to configure in your app. A note here, it's called restrictions for historical reasons, but this does not have to be just policy restrictions. This can be any configuration that you want, like server configurations and stuff. You can also include a list. Typically you would have individual restrictions or settings with keys and values, but you could also have a bundle and a bundle array which groups configurations together. So this is an example, a real-life example of what the Gmail app has exposed, and this is what the IT admins would see from their side. So this is an iframe that EMMs can include in their web interface, and it queries the app's manifest and then finds out what settings are available for them to configure, and all that is just automatically generated for them. And then IT admins can fill those values, including wildcards as well if they wanted to, and then save it as a policy and then publish those policies to whatever devices they want. So it actually saves a lot of time for new employees enrolling and onboarding to companies. The second step, once you declare those configurations, the second step is to listen to any changes that come from the EMM APIs. To do that, you would want to handle it whenever the app relaunches, so in on resume. You would also want to be listening to a specific broadcast message in case it happens during your app activity already being run. So it's really simple to get the restrictions. You just find the restriction service using the system services, and then you could just call applications restrictions. It's worth noting here that applications restrictions is actually a time-consuming call as well, so you should be trying to cache that as much as possible. And then once you get the application restrictions, you could like query specific configurations or restrictions using the key that you've defined in your restrictions app. and then change the flow in your app based on the values there. And the third step is it's really a good practice to send back feedback, whether your settings have been successfully set or not, so that IT admins would be aware if anything went wrong. They could collect error messages or error codes and deal with them accordingly. So either retry, or if there's like a big, if they had a typo, for example, in their server and it wasn't working, they'll get a lot of error messages and they'll know that they need to change something. So it's really good practice. To do that, there's an Android enterprise library called Feedback that you should include in your app. You would be creating a keyed app state, which you define the key for that particular setting and any data that you want to include there as well. Yeah, typical message, for example, would be an error message if something went wrong, or just an acknowledgement message. All right, so you've done all that. You've followed all the best practices. You've created some managed configurations and exposed them. How are you supposed to be able to test that without being part of an EMM yourself or being part of an enterprise world yourself? Well, luckily, Google's built this really cool app called Test DPC that you could download today from the Play Store. And what it does is two things. It sets up a fake or a dummy work profile for you. So you would actually have a managed Play Store. You would have your own work profile that you could switch back and forth to. And it also comes with a bunch of configurations that you could set as if an EMM would actually enforce on. So you could enable or disable specific intents to cross profiles. You could disable apps, including system apps. You could apply restrictions just as the managed configurations that we talked about, so they could you could see how your app would behave according to different restrictions being sent to you as well. Yeah, so that's pretty much all I had. I would strongly recommend you guys check the documentation and developers Android/work. It has pretty much everything I covered, plus a few more features that are really cool, including the single sign-on feature, for example, and some other really cool stuff that, yeah, I'd recommend checking out. If you guys have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, thanks.